Chattel slavery was unlike any other system of enslavement in history due to its permanence, racialization, and extreme dehumanization. Unlike ancient slavery, where individuals could sometimes earn their freedom, marry into society, or hold status, American slavery was hereditary. Children born to enslaved mothers were enslaved for life, with no legal pathway to freedom. This system was codified into law, ensuring that black people were permanently seen as property, not individuals with rights. And while some point out that Africans participated in the slave trade by selling captives to Europeans, it is crucial to recognize that the system that they contributed to was vastly different from the chattel slavery that emerged in the Americas. African societies engaged in slavery as a byproduct of war or debt, often with opportunities for eventual freedom. What Europeans created was industrialized systems that permanently dehumanized an entire race with no possibility of liberation or dignity. American slavery was explicitly racial, with blackness itself becoming a marker of bondage. While slavery in other parts of the world often resulted from war or punishment, American chattel slavery was built on the belief that black people were inherently inferior and suited only to servitude. This racial hierarchy was reinforced through laws that criminalized literacy, denied enslaved people legal recognition, and sanctioned extreme violence to maintain control. Families were routinely torn apart at auction blocks, and enslaved women were subject to systemic sexual violence, further ensuring the continued reproduction of enslaved laborers without the need for importation. The argument that Africans sold their own ignores the agency of European powers who established and maintained the transatlantic slave trade, turning human lives into commodities and profiting from unimaginable suffering. The brutality of American chattel slavery was unparalleled in its scale and impact, not only on the enslaved, but on the economic and political structures of the nation. The labor of enslaved people fueled the Southern economy, particularly through cotton and tobacco production, while the entire country, including northern industries and international markets, profited from their exploitation. Even after emancipation, the racial caste system it created did not end. It transformed into segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism that continues to shape American society to this day. American chattel slavery was not just a labor system. It was a deeply entrenched, institutionalized atrocity that sought to erase the personhood of an entire people, leaving a lasting legacy of racial oppression. To reduce this history to Africans selling their own overlooks the unprecedented cruelty and systematic dehumanization that defined American slavery and its enduring consequences.
What did you think we were before you began to think of us as human beings?
Well, in a way, we thought of you almost as a very superior pet. Something, or rather someone, we had to take care of. Because we had to do so much of their thinking for them. We had to do almost everything for them, except living their own lives. Anything outside, we had to do for them.
Melanated people on here just now found out that they ate Nat Turner when they caught him.
What?
They ate him because they thought they were going to get superpowers because he was killing them.
Oh my God.
They also just found out that there was different types of plantations. It wasn't just picking cotton and tobacco. They had breeding plantations where they bred us like dogs. They had fighting plantations where you would just fight all day. They had cattle plantations where they raised us like animals to eat. They made leather out of our skin.
Oh my God!
They made furniture out of our skin and filled it with our hair. Wait till you find out that George Washington, they told you George Washington had wooden teeth, but that's a lie. His teeth were made out of lead, mercury, and slave teeth, and horse teeth. They used to use us for extra spare body parts. That slavery that they taught you in school is not really what happened, people. I just want y'all to know that.
is teaching white Americans how white slave owners raped, beat, humiliated, mutilated, murdered, and cannibalized their slaves. Accurate history is teaching that George Washington's false teeth were made out of his slaves' teeth. Accurate history is teaching that Abraham Lincoln may have said some words and signed some shit, but he did not physically do anything to free the slaves. The white abolitionists also often get almost total credit for freeing the slaves. I bet you've never even asked yourself what the slaves were doing to free themselves, and the answer to that is most of the fucking work, including giving the ultimatum of war. But then we get a bunch of white people mad that their kids might feel guilty if we teach real history. It's not about your white child's feelings. Teaching accurate history isn't about white people's feelings, but that does sound like something that someone who's only ever been taught a white glorifying version of history would counter with.
Let her cook.
Ask why we ever felt like we needed to curate a false version of what white people did and did not do to black people to begin with, and then ask yourself why white-ass politicians are verbally attacking real history by calling it slurs, which is, by default, also the act of calling black people slurs.
Now, we've been talking about slavery off and on, okay? And I feel like we just jumped right into the middle when we started talking about the slave narratives, okay? So let's back up. Let's start at the beginning, okay? And we're going to talk about chattel slavery and how the colonists stripped African slaves of their personhood and their rights. And first, we're going to start with some definitions. Yeah? Yeah. Now, the United States, European colonialism, practiced chattel slavery. So, what is chattel slavery? Well, that allowed people to be considered legal property, and it allowed people to be bought and sold and owned forever. Now, for comparison, an indentured servant is a person who is contracted to work without salary for a specific number of years, usually done to pay off a loan, or it was used to pay for the voyage to the New World. That's how people were coming to the States back in the day. Okay. First, in the United States, Native Americans, they were typically the ones who were enslaved. Over time, indentured servants and Native American slaves were replaced with African slaves. From there, slavery was legalized and became something that was a for life situation. And that's when the colonists started stripping away the rights of African slaves. And we'll be using Virginia and South Carolina as the example, since they were the colonies with the largest slave populations at the time. In 1662, Virginia enacted a law that says all children born to enslaved mothers inherit her slave status. Now, this is important because originally the status would follow the father. Here's the problem. White men had a habit of violating African women, creating children who were considered black, and they were free. So by having the status follow the mother, they were now creating children who became property. Yes. In 1669, Virginia became the first colony to declare that it was not a crime to unalive an unruly slave in the ordinary course of punishment. So now, an African slave no longer has the right to protect themselves. That same year, Virginia also prohibited masters from freeing their slaves. They no longer have the right to freedom. 1682, Virginia declares that all imported black servants are slaves for life. And there goes your freedom. all the other colonies started making laws that did the same thing, differentiated black from white, and made black people slaves and made them slaves for life. In 1705, the Virginia Slave Code codifies slave status and defines slaves as real estate property, not people, not human beings, but real estate. And then it acquitted masters who unalived slaves during punishment. And it forbid slaves and free colored peoples from physically assaulting white people. Did you pay attention to the steps they took to strip African slaves of their personhood, of their rights? Did you follow along? So yesterday, we started discussing chattel slavery and how it differed under European colonization and United States intervention, right? And we defined slavery and chattel slavery and what an enslaved person was. And then we compared it to indentured servitude. And we started talking about the laws that Virginia passed and how they stripped Africans of their personhood. Now, let's talk about South Carolina. Oh, South Carolina. Yeah. May 10th, 1740. South Carolina Assembly enacted the Bill for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves in this province. Now, I'm pretty sure we've talked about the Negro Act of 1740. I'm pretty sure we talked about it. It codified the institution of chattel slavery in South Carolina, and it also codified the slaves' lack of access to the rights of English common law. It took away their civil rights, and it made them non-entities. Non-entities. And it said that the unaliving of a slave by a white person was reduced to a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine. But penalties for slave crimes increased. Execution was sanctioned for plotting rebellion or running away, committing arson, or instructing other slaves in the use of poisonous plants, because they were afraid that their slaves were poisoning them. In some cases, they were. Any white person, not just slave owners, were given the authority to arrest and punish black people found in violation of the law. Slave writing was prohibited. Learning to read and write was prohibited. What else was? Drumming and playing horns for fear that these activities might awaken some revolutionary impulse was prohibited. In 1822, Denmark Vesey was accused of organizing a massive slave uprising. Almost 40 slaves, including Vesey, are executed. Others are sold out of state. And because of Denmark Vesey, South Carolina passed a law stating that contact between slaves and free black sailors was prohibited. And as part of the Negro Seamen Act, they jailed free black sailors while their ships were in South Carolina ports. They jailed free black sailors while their ships were in South Carolina ports. Yeah. And in 1851, the General Assembly outlawed manumission, freeing of slaves, as a measure to cut down on the number of free people of color in the state. They didn't want free people in the state, so they said, let's not free any of the slaves. Yeah. And I will never forget that it is South Carolina's state Supreme Court that said enslaved mothers had no right to their children, and that South Carolina passed a law that said enslaved children could be sold at any age. Now, we only talked about South Carolina and Virginia over the last 2 days, but the other colonies, including the ones in the North, they did something similar. They first legalized slavery, distinguished between black and white, and said that black people would be the slaves and that they would be slaves for life, said that it is illegal to free slaves, said that children would take the status of the mother, ensuring that the children born of black women would be property. And then they started stripping away their rights. No rights to protect yourselves from harm or even unaliving. No rights to learn to read or write, to free speech, to travel, to your own time or your own bodies or your own children or even your own life. Chattel slavery, the system, took everything away from enslaved black.
Now, I didn't know that this wasn't common knowledge. And if you didn't know this, that means you don't follow me. But white people have always indulged in cannibalism. They ate their slaves and they ate black people that were free after the Emancipation Proclamation, after lynchings. If you didn't know this, you don't follow me. And if you don't follow me, you should follow me. My name's Chemistry. I teach Black history. I'm not part of Hillman Talk. I just do this for fun and out of the passion that I have for spreading Black history. And just like everything else on my page, I'm not just feeding you a bunch of bullshit. There are a plethora of books that you can look into that proves that this is a fact. Books like The Delectable Negro, which covers recipes of how to eat black people. Another book called Edible People, The Historical Consumption of Negroes and Foreigners. And I believe it was like The Cannibalistic Trade. And that's just two of many. But yeah, if you want to know more about the topic, if you scroll down on my page, I have a video called White People Ate Black People. It's very, very informative. So go ahead, learn you something. Follow me. I teach Black history. Also tap my link tree. I have a nonprofit, a YouTube, all that good stuff.
During the slave trade, if you didn't know, there was a lot of cannibalism happening, white cannibalism to be exact. Every accusation is a confession, because when we start talking about Otabanga, that was something that white zoologists wanted to instill in the public, that Africans practice cannibalism. However, West Africans had a fear of Christians because there was a fear of being eaten by them, and rightfully so. Look up the Arrogante. Hell, look up the Vessel Robert of 1721. During the antebellum era, when medicine was being practiced, black people had no say in our medical treatment because we were enslaved and seen as property. So obviously Dr. J. Marion Sims took advantage of that, amongst other doctors during that time as well. J. Marion Sims, as revered as he was by this country, which is quite insane, he was known for forced experimentation as well as taking shoemakers' tools to black babies' skulls. So during the 1800s, Sam, which was a 42-year-old laborer that worked on a plantation in rural Alabama, had chronic pain in his jaw. Now, Sam found it difficult to eat and complete his tasks on the plantation, so his owner sent out a surgeon to come and take a look at him. And the surgeon at first thought he had syphilis, but later diagnosed him with osteosarcoma, which is a cancer on the lower jaw. And so this physician referred Sam to Dr. J. Marion Sims. However, Sam did not want to go through the surgery because he knew it would hurt so bad. I also feel as if he heard of that reputation that Sims had amongst other antebellum doctors who would just experiment on slaves, because later on we'll talk about how we were used as clinical material. And so Sam's owner said that he was going to get the surgery regardless if Sam refused or not. So upon meeting Sam, Sims actually tricked him into sitting into a barber's chair where 5 other physicians held Sam down while they restrained him around his thighs, knees, ankles, abdomen, chest, shoulders, arms, wrist, elbow, and head. While Sims and those physicians immobilized Sam, there were 25 other people in the room. Some were medical students and some were interested others meaning they were probably just sadistic fucks. It took Sims 40 minutes to remove Sam's lower jaw without any anesthesia. When Sims was finished, he stated that the surgery proved practical whether the patient was willing or not. New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal would later on report that they were pleased to record the highly credible achievement of a Southern surgeon. And Sims' medical report stated that Sam's mouth is always open in a wide grin.
Peace. No, lynchings of black people in the United States is not the origin of picnics, nor is pick a N-word the etymology of the word picnic. Unsurprisingly, picnic is actually of French origin, picnic. And picnic isn't recorded in the English language until about the 1800s, with a similar meaning to modern-day picnics, a social gathering involving food. That said, there is a gory intersection between picnics and lynchings. You see, for white America, lynchings were once a source of social festivities. Quite literally. There were even instances of a condemned black man being paraded around on a float before being tortured and burned alive to death. Food and souvenirs were sold at these events, including bits of the condemned black bodies that were desecrated for trinkets and even consumption. Yes, at times white lynch mobs would even cannibalize the tortured remains of the black people they murdered. So racist lynchings being the origin of picnics and pick a N-word being the etymology of the word picnic is untrue. But the reason so many people, particularly black people, believe it is because of a gruesome truth. We outcha.
Let's talk about one of the ugliest, most dehumanizing stories in American history. The way people used to talk about black babies being used as alligator bait. Because that isn't just some wild urban legend or some folklore to laugh off. It's a window into just how little black life was valued. And honestly, when I heard about alligator Alcatraz in Florida, that's exactly where my mind went. And based on my DMs and y'all's comments, I know I'm not the only one. So what does that even mean, black babies as alligator bait? It's a story that's lived in black communities for generations, that enslavers or white hunters would use black infants to lure alligators from the swamp. It sounds so grotesque that people just want to dismiss it outright. Just call it folklore. But here's the truth. In the early 20th century, the newspapers printed it as a joke. Headlines that said, bait alligators with pickaninnies. They wrote these stories as if it was just entertainment. They didn't hide it, they laughed about it. They printed it because they knew that white readers would find it funny. Now, was it some widespread systematic practice? Historians will tell you there's no evidence of organized trade using babies as bait. But those headlines weren't invented out of thin air. They existed because the idea felt believable in a society that saw black life as cheap, as disposable. Because they thought so little of black children that feeding them to animals seemed normal enough to print and sell. And it didn't stop there, it became a part of Jim Crow culture. Postcards, cartoons, images of black kids chased by alligators, sold in tourist shops. It wasn't hidden, it was marketed. It was taught to white children as normal. It was a tool of terror, turning black children into prey in the white imagination. That's the horror that people want to gloss over. Not just the violence itself, but the normalization of it. The fact that you could put it on a postcard, sell it as a joke, make it a part of the culture, because black life was just that cheap. So yeah, when I hear about alligator Alcatraz, even if it's a migrant detention camp in 2025, built in the Florida swamps to scare people from escaping, of course that name hits a nerve, because it shows just how comfortable this country still is, using the name of wildlife in cages and fear to dehumanize people. It doesn't even have to intend that history to bring it back for those of us who know it. Because we remember what that alligator imagery used to mean. We remember that this country joked about feeding our children to animals. We remember that it was entertaining to them, that our pain was marketable, that our children were seen as bait. So no, don't tell me that was just a myth with no legacy. Ask why those headlines existed at all. Ask why it was funny to them. Because it tells you exactly how they saw us. Not as humans, not as children, but as disposable. And that mindset, it isn't gone. It just learned how to hide better. It just finds new targets. And if we don't say that out loud, they're just going to keep pretending that it never happened.
So the University of Florida just removed all of their DEI positions. But isn't that ironic, because this is the same school that just got called out a few years ago because their students had a long-standing tradition of chanting a slur that referenced when white people would use black babies to bait alligators. So just for context, the mascot of the University of Florida is an alligator, and at sporting events they used to call the opposing team gator bait. What you might not know is that gator bait was actually a slur that was used to reference black babies in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is because of a number of articles in newspapers that documented white hunters taking black children from their families in order to lure alligators, oftentimes in the state of Florida. And perhaps what's even more telling is the array of memorabilia that shows the widespread enthusiasm the white Americans had around this idea. Black babies being shown as alligator bait was used in product advertisements, it was used in Florida postcards, as children's toys, and there were even songs like Mammy's Little Alligator Bait, which you can see the sheet music of right here. And just to preempt it, a University of Florida historian claims they didn't have explicit evidence of the chant being connected to this racist practice. But he also didn't say that he knew the exact origin of the chant gator bait being used at University of Florida events. In my humble opinion, it's very likely that such a widespread and ingrained cultural trope is what brought the lexicon of gator bait into University of Florida sporting traditions, especially seeing as this is the exact same region of the country that the practice reportedly occurred. And it's because of these clear and plausible connections that the university ended up banning the chant in the wake of the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And to be clear, this is just one example of very overt racism seeping into modern school traditions. But if a chant connected to such racist history can go unnoticed, who knows what other structural, overt racism from the country's past is affecting the university today? For example, the school had long been segregated until the 1950s. But even decades after the decision to integrate, reports show that the racist legacy of segregation still affected black students on campus. And whether it be chanting slurs at sporting events or larger structural issues related to social life on campus, it's impossible to pretend that the school and state's racist history magically have no bearing on the university today. And while these anti-DEI laws will probably get a little bit worse before they get better, it's at least worth calling out what these racist conservatives are trying to hide.
So today, let's talk about the slave auction. Yeah. So prior to the auction itself, an enslaved person had to be prepared for the auction because future buyers would be examining them before making a purchase. So the goal was to make them look healthy because a lot of times they are going straight from the boat where they have spent however many months crammed in the depths of the boat, going straight from the boat to the auction. So captains, surgeons, or crew members would wash the captives, usually with seawater, and then give them rum so that their eyes would seem alive. Then they would slather them with oil or animal fat to accentuate their muscles. They would fix up the wounds with gunpowder or iron rust, and then they would sew their anuses shut to stop the leakage, because they were literally fed crap on the voyage over. Palm oil, gunpowder would be rubbed on to the captives to cover up bruises, sores, and cuts. And they would be branded, men on the arm and women on their breasts. Another way to prep the future enslaved person was through seasoning. This was a period of adjustment where merchants and traders conditioned future enslaved individuals so they could get used to their new life on plantations. Really, it was just a way to break the African captive's spirit by taking away their identity, their language, and their culture. They would shave off all their hair, change their name, and feed them very little. And then they would be sent to the West Indies before being sold in the American South so that they would know what it was like to work on a plantation. And then prior to the auction, in some cases at the auction, African captives were examined as though they were literally cattle. The buyers pulled their mouth open to see their teeth, pinched their limbs to find out how muscular they were, walked them up and down to detect any signs of lameness, made them stoop and bend in different ways that they might be certain there was no concealed rupture or wound. And we've talked about how women had their breasts poked and prodded, and how they were taken somewhere private for inspection. All of this was done so that the future owners felt as though they were getting a good buy. Now, that was for a regular auction. There was another form of a slave auction called a scramble. And it was called a scramble because buyers would run around in an open space all at once to gather as many African captives as possible. It was also called a grab and go. Now, once the slave ship was docked and brought onto land, Africans would be herded into the designated area, surrounded by eager buyers who were often pushing and shoving to position themselves to the front of the pen's doors. The scramble was started by signal, either by a gunshot or a drumbeat, and once this was heard, the buyers swarmed into the pen to collect as many individuals as they could. Who was it? Aluda Equano, there we go, an African captive who was able to gain his freedom, describes the scramble as starting from a signal. It was the beat of a drum. And Equano said that the buyers rushed into the yard and the buyers grabbed the enslaved people that they liked the best. Slave auctions broke up families. Slave auctions are where families were torn apart. Husbands were sold away from wives. Children were sold away from mothers. If someone died in debt, their enslaved people would be sold at auction. Just like Thomas Jefferson, he died in debt. And all of his enslaved people were sold at auction. If someone couldn't pay off their debts, their enslaved people were sold on the auction block. Want to remodel your home? Sell a slave or two at auction. African slaves, black slaves, were literally used as money. They weren't just used as cattle, they were used as money.
Let's cut the shit. Slavery in America wasn't just about forced labor. It was about forced birth. America didn't just work enslaved people to death. It bred them. And not like people, like livestock. If the transatlantic slave trade was a kidnapping, breeding plantations were the farm. And I said what I said. After the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808, the U.S. had a problem. They still wanted the free labor, but they had no more legal supply. Their solution? Turn black wombs into factories. Breeding plantations, and yes, they were called that, were designed specifically to reproduce more enslaved people. The goal wasn't to grow food, it wasn't to pick cotton. It was to force women to give birth to more product. Because that's what we were. Product. Black women weren't seen as mothers. They were uteruses with a resale value. Their fertility, that was the commodity. And their babies, assets on a ledger. Let's be real. This was organized. Some enslavers forced women to have 10, 12, 15 children. Not out of love, but out of cold-blooded capitalism. Some kept track of their pregnancies like breeding dogs. Black girls, as young as 13, were to kickstart their production. If they couldn't reproduce, they were often whipped, sold, or killed. And don't you dare forget about the men. Black men were used as studs. That's literally the word they used. They were, too, forced to mate with women chosen by their enslaver, sometimes their own family, sometimes multiple women in a row. Consent was a fantasy, trauma was the norm. And the goal was always profit. Virginia, Maryland, and parts of North Carolina became baby farms for the Deep South. And once those babies hit a certain age, they were sold down the river, often with chains still attached to their mother's arms. This is the legacy that birthed America's wealth. Families like the Talos, the Ball family, and others made millions off of children born from these violent systems. Wall Street was built to insure and trade these bodies. And if you're wondering why Black women still aren't believed about our pain, why we're 3 times more likely to die in childbirth, this is the root. Doctors experimented on those same women without anesthesia. Gynecology was literally founded on the abuse of Black wombs. So no, slavery wasn't just labor. It was a full-blown human breeding industry. And if that makes you uncomfortable, it should, because America wasn't built by accident. It was built with intentional, systemic, with generational torture passed off as policy. And the fact that you can visit some of these plantations today and see wedding venues instead of crime scenes, that tells you everything about what this country values. Not justice, not truth, just comfort for white folks. But we're not going to be quiet about it. We're not going to soften the language anymore. And we're not going to let the history die just because they're ashamed of it. This happened, and now they're going to hear about it every damn time we speak.
So forced reproduction is making sure that enslaved women are continuously giving birth, those that are in the age range of being fertile. Enslavers waited to find out when a young girl had her first menstrual cycle. They were like literally wanting to know. Sometimes they would force people to have relations, and they would say that we've selected you two to breed with one another. And imagine for a woman and a man, if they have other partners, that they are considered that's their husband or their wife. The enslaver didn't care about that. They were looking at the body, the stalk, the physique, all of that. They literally paired two people up, locked them in a cabin, and said, until we see evidence of pregnancy, you're going to be whipped 30 lashes a day.
It's unspeakable.
It is.
And yet we have to speak about it.
We have to speak about it because we haven't. People are in denial at how prevalent this was. And I think to even say that this was breeding is an important statement to make.
Yes.
Because the construct of race made black women's children innately enslavable, enslavers were assured a profit with every birth. And that assurance became even more important in 1808 after Congress banned the importation of Africans to the United States. With the supply of newly enslaved people from Africa cut off, enslavers had to rely on a single source to replenish their essential labor force, the wombs of black women. The numbers are staggering. In 1790, the first United States Census counted just under 700,000 enslaved people. By 1860, despite the congressional ban that had been in place for more than half a century, the enslaved population had blossomed to nearly 4 million. And the rape of black women by white men played a significant role in that increase. Rape was so prevalent during slavery that today, a quarter of the genetic makeup of black Americans can be traced back to Europe through the paternal line.
Okay, let's pick up with, we were talking about people not coming back to tell, and you were about to tell me a story, a Shati story.
Yes. In 1817, there was this British traveler to Asante, and he spoke to the Asante at that time called Osei-Bonsu. And Osei-Bonsu was asking why the British had abolished the Atlantic enslavement. Britain had passed a law in 1807, and this was 1817, and Asante was beginning to feel the effects of the Atlantic enslavement abolition, because Asante was still engaged in a lot of warfare, so there were still a lot of prisoners of war. And this is where you see the relationship and the effect of Atlantic enslavement, because it would have been an easy access. There would be access on the coast for all these slaves to be shipped. Now Asante was torn with what to do with all these prisoners of war. And then this envoy tried to explain to the Asante that we stopped because he looked at the humanitarian reasons. It was bad, it caused warfare, it did this, it did that. And the Asante chief was very surprised. He said, "Oh, did you know this all along when we were involved in this trade all these years? But we didn't think it was bad." And then he brings out what our internal system and understanding is about enslavement. So it meant that when the two people were involved in the trade, both of them had a different idea of what was happening. So for the African, he knew the internal indigenous system, and he thought it was the same system which was being followed elsewhere. So that was the first time in 1817, when the trade had been abolished 10 years ago, that the Asante Hinimbi was even made aware of the differences between the two systems.
You were saying just earlier that probably at the fort, it's the first time the African began to realize this was something different. Try to give me some specifics in terms of the kinds of things that would kind of stand out. Suppose a whole family's been captured, kidnapped, brought down from the north, traveled all the way together down to the castle. What would they encounter in the castle that would suddenly let them know that this is not going to be the same situation. You're not going to be taken into a family and become a part of any clan, but things would be severely different.
Well, if whole families are taken, for example, from the north to the coast, one of the things which will strike them is that they'll be separated. And the separation would at once tell them that something is happening, because most people who would have families would want to keep them. Because in the African sense, the more families you had, the larger the family, the better. And in terms of labor, in terms of wealth, in terms of prestige. So you wouldn't separate families, you would keep them because they were an important asset. Now you get to the fort and castle, and the first thing which is done is separation. You are not regarded as one family anymore. You are separated. Father, mother, children are all separated. And that will be the first thing. The second thing, perhaps, which will surprise some of them, would be maybe the way they are treated in terms of harshness or in terms of even food that they are given.
I'm sorry, yes, I cut. Sound is rolling.
77, take 2.
Talk to me about a family coming down from the north. What would they encounter at the castle? Why would they know once they arrived at the castle things were going to be different?
If a family is brought down from the north, for example, to the coast during the Atlantic enslavement, one of the first cultural shocks they would have would be separation. In the internal system, the more people you had, the better it was. So you wouldn't separate families who have been enslaved because you needed them. You needed them for social reasons, for prestige, and so on. Now, a family gets to the castle, and one of the first shocks is that they're going to be separated. They're not going to be recognized as one family. They're going to be recognized as any other individual human being. And perhaps another second shock any family which gets to the forts and castles will experience will be in terms of how they are treated. Because in the internal system, we've mentioned how slaves were supposed to be treated in terms of food, clothing, shelter, caring for them, making them as part of your children. And they'll realize at once that there's an impersonal aspect to the treatment. Perhaps even the food they are given may not be enough. Perhaps they will not be properly clothed. Maybe the same clothes they wore on their way will be what they'll be wearing. And so they'll find that they are in a different world altogether in terms of treatment, how they are cared for, what the concern of the new owners are. And I'm sure that would have given them a sign that they are in for something very, very different. And of course, if they are shipped across the sea, we know the story already. The experience in the ship, the long journey, and what happens outside, it's another further cultural shock. And what saddens me about this whole thing is the fact that people cannot come back to tell the story. They come back when it's very late, when abolition is in the way, to tell the story that this is very, very different from what we knew. I have had some kind of cultural shock myself personally. In 1993-94, I was in the University of Texas in Austin, US for 1 year, doing some research from the American sources because I had done a lot on the Ghanaian sources. I had been to London to look at British sources. And I was looking at the American sources. And from my experience in the indigenous system, I had an idea of how indigenous enslavement was like. And as I read through these American sources, sometimes I felt like closing the books because I couldn't take it any longer. And I couldn't reconcile. Sometimes I had to go back a few days and strengthen myself emotionally and come back and say, now you're a historian. Look at the facts as they stand.
I'm in the Rijksmuseum right now in Amsterdam, and I'm in a room that is covered with ship models and model ships. Many of these are from the Dutch golden age of, quote unquote, golden age of exploration, trading, and colonization. One ship in particular that caught my attention was this tall-masted white ship in the center of this exhibit display. There's a small plaque in a dark corner of the museum that explains what this ship is. The extra wide hull and the extra tall masts identify this as a Dutch merchant ship specializing in the trade of enslaved people. The ship is named as the White Elephant, de Witte Olifant, and it was specifically designed for African slave trade. And the most disturbing part about this ship is the tall masts. You can see that from all of the other ships in the display, that one has clearly the highest and tallest masts for the largest sails. The reason that it needed those sails was to go as fast as possible across the Atlantic because the human beings would die. even with these ships being the most high speed of any of the Dutch ships at the time, still close to 1/4 of the human beings on board who were being brought across the Atlantic as enslaved workers would die in the crossing. The fact that these new ships were designed faster with bigger and taller masts for this explicit purpose really shows us the fallacy at the root of the saying capitalism breeds innovation, because really exactly what sort of innovation is being bred here? It's gut-wrenchingly awful and painful. Slavery was an abomination, and the Rijksmuseum needs to do a better job contextualizing and condemning this barbaric practice.
So, let me tell you a story that was never supposed to be told. Because if people really understood how chattel slavery started, they'd have to admit that this country was never innocent. It wasn't founded on freedom. It was founded on a formula: blood, control, and legal torture. See, chattel slavery wasn't just slavery. It was the most brutal, calculated system of human degradation ever written into law. And America didn't inherit it. It built it on purpose. So we're taught that the story starts in 1619 when the original enslaved people arrived in Virginia. But it really starts way before that on the coast of West Africa, where human beings were hunted, villages raided, mothers dragged from their homes, babies taken from their backs, people chained together, branded with hot irons, burned like cattle before they even touched a slave ship. Then came the Middle Passage, bodies stacked below deck, no air, no light, no dignity. Many died. Some jumped into the ocean on their own terms. They would rather drown than be sold. But when they arrived in the colonies, they weren't welcomed. They were inspected, priced, and sold. Children torn from mothers, spouses separated without a second thought. And the worst part? There were no laws protecting them, because there were no laws that recognized them as human. They weren't seen as people, because they were property. And yeah, some African leaders played a role in the trade. Some sold prisoners of war or rival groups into European hands. But this idea that Africans sold their own people, that's a distraction. Africa is a continent full of hundreds of cultures and languages. The Europeans showed up with weapons, gold, and a business model, and they built the market for human lives. Without European demand, there is no transatlantic slave trade. Full stop. In the early colonial days, slavery didn't start as permanent. Some Africans were treated as indentured servants, just like poor Europeans. But then white landowners saw an opportunity. Why release a worker when you can just own them forever? Why pay for labor when you can force women to give birth to your next generation of workers? So they changed the laws. If your mother was enslaved, you were too. No exceptions. Becoming Christian didn't mean freedom anymore. White servants got contracts and land. Black people got lifelong bondage. That wasn't confusion. That was strategy. They were never trying to civilize Black people. They were trying to own them forever. But wait, how do you convince a society that all of this is okay? You build a lie. They said Black people were cursed, less intelligent, animal-like. They used scripture. They used fake science, measuring skulls, ranking races, and publishing pseudoscience to prove what they already decided was true. They needed people to believe that we were made for this. Because if we were human, then the system couldn't be justified. So they rewrote what it meant to be human. White supremacy wasn't born out of slavery. It was born with it. By the 1700s, America wasn't using slavery. It was running on it. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, every dollar was built on Black backs. And our bodies weren't just labor, they were capital. You could borrow money against an enslaved person, insure them, trade them. Black women were forced to give birth not for family, but for profit. They turned wombs into factories. Wall Street involved. Banks invested. Universities funded by it. Presidents benefited. This wasn't a broken system. This was the system. People love to call it America's original sin. But sin sounds like a mistake. This wasn't a mistake. This was a blueprint. A system designed to extract everything from Black life. Labor, language, names, lineage, and leave us buried in unmarked graves. And after they took everything, they rewrote the story to make themselves look like heroes. So no, chattel slavery wasn't about labor. It was about domination, reproduction, and inheritance. It wasn't just brutal. It was intentional, legal, and profitable. And it didn't end when it was abolished. It just evolved into prisons, into housing policies, into generational theft. So, you want to talk about American values? Well, this was the first one, and this country has been protecting it ever since. Before we start, this story is heavy. It's not easy to hear, and it's not supposed to be. If you need a minute, take it. We'll see you in the next one. They told you slavery was a sad story, a tragedy, something you could learn about for 5 minutes, pass a quiz, and move on. They lied. Slavery wasn't sadness. It was terror, blood, and survival stitched into the soil of this country. In the 1930s, the U.S. government tried to document living memories of slavery. They expected nostalgia, but instead they got horror, and they buried most of it. Sarah Goodger, born around 1816, remembered it clearly. She said night and day, it was all work. No rest, no play. The lash was going all the time. Work till you dropped. Dreams beaten out before they could even form. Fountain Hughes, born in Virginia, said in his own voice, "When we were slaves, we belonged to people. They sold us like they sell horses and cows and hogs. Owned, used, discarded." And then there's Millie Barber, who told a truth so sharp, it'll leave you bleeding if you listen closely. Well, my pa belongs to one man. My ma belongs to another. 4 or 5 miles apart cause some confusion, mix-up, and heartaches. My pa have to get a pass to come see my mama. And he comes sometimes without the pass. Controllers catch him way up the chimney hiding one night. They stripped him right before my mom and gave him 39 lashes, with her crying and hollering louder than he did. Let that sit for a minute. You needed permission to love. You needed permission to see your family. And if you didn't have it, they beat you half to death in front of the people that you loved the most. And somehow America still wants to tell this same old story like it was complicated. The real slave narratives aren't about loyalty. They're not about singing in the fields or kind owners. They're about blood, terror, chains, and survival that roared louder than a whip ever could. You hear me? The next time somebody tries to hand you a whitewashed version of our history, remember that our ancestors didn't crawl through hell just for their stories to be silenced. They screamed it into the roots of this land. And we're the ones that are carrying their voices forward, loud, fierce, and impossible to bury again.
U.S. churches were full-fledged stakeholders in slavery. Episcopal, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist. Major denominations owned enslaved people, rented them out, and in some cases, they confined them in jail-like pens beneath or beside their sanctuaries, while white Christians prayed upstairs. Black men, women, and children were shackled below, treated as inventory instead of human beings. Now, it was common for enslavers to require their slaves to go to church so that they could learn about being a humble slave to their masters. But these people held in the pens below were livestock waiting to be sold, being punished, who knows what. Georgetown University's Jesuit priests sold 272 enslaved people in 1838 to pay off school debts. In Charleston, St. Philip's, and St. Michael's, they forced black attendees into upper galleries while white parishioners sat in comfort below. Methodist ministers in the South regularly enslaved people as personal property. And of course, many ministers in the South enslaved people as personal property. Southern Baptists split from Northern Baptists in 1845 for one reason: to defend their right to keep enslaved people. Churches built slave galleries to force enslaved people to attend services, but not sit with white people. And the sermons told them to obey their masters. But the people locked in the church pens, they weren't taken upstairs to worship. They were confined like livestock. They were waiting to be sold, rented, or punished. The church baptized enslaved people. They preached a lot about obedience, and they promised them life after death in heaven, while profiting from their stolen lives on earth. This is white history, and white Christians especially need to own it. My username works as my address in case I disappear. Get curious. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois identified the psychological wage of whiteness. Trump's been selling the same fake paycheck ever since. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Black Reconstruction in America that after the Civil War, poor white people didn't get money or land. What they got was status. The police, courts, public schools, social space all treated them better just because they were white. That's the psychological wage of whiteness. It didn't fill their bellies, but it made them feel superior. And that feeling kept them from uniting with black people against the wealthy elite who were exploiting both groups. Fast forward to today. My working class relatives still vote for Trump. Not because he's delivered, he hasn't. They keep voting for him because he hands them that same imaginary status. He talks like they matter more, like they're being targeted by others, those immigrants or those people with dark skin. He gives them that rush of being the real Americans. He makes them feel like they're part of the elite crowd. He gives them that rush of being the real Americans, feeling like they're winning, even as their healthcare gets gutted and paychecks shrink. That's not leadership. That's emotional manipulation. It's the same scam Du Bois described, rewrapped for modern TV viewers. We have been hoodwinked. All that status is a mirage. It cannot buy groceries. It cannot fix your kid's asthma. It cannot lower your prescription costs. But it keeps us fighting against each other so that the real elites never have to get their hands dirty. And they don't have to pay a dime. Recognize the scam. Call it out. One share says you're done with the bullshit. I am not an expert. I'm just an avid learner. You can be one too. If you'd like to support my work, please visit my Ko-Fi link. It's here and you can find it in my bio.
If you're an anti-racist, there's one text you should read, and that's Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Souls of Black Folk is most well known for the theory of double consciousness that Du Bois talks about in the book. Double consciousness basically means that white supremacy fractures the black self. That black people have to live in white people's perception of us, and then we have our true actual self. Double consciousness puts an unfair emotional and psychological burden on black people to always be aware of how white people are perceiving us. Essentially what Du Bois is highlighting is what I call in my work the racial perception gap, this way that white supremacy distorts the black self. And in my work as a consultant, I see the impact of the racial perception gap. And I see this most clearly when black people are passed up for senior leadership positions, even though they have all the qualifications, but their blackness is understood as being a disqualifying factor. The problem with the racial perception gap is that part of white supremacy is this belief in objectivity. And I believe Du Bois is inviting white allies, folks that want to be in this work, white anti-racists, to really start to excavate your own perception of blackness, how you understand blackness. As a theologian, I think about blackness as a sacred site, and so much of that is revolutionary because white supremacy denigrates and subjugates blackness as this ugly thing. And the reality blackness is so beautiful and expansive and divine. And again, I think anti-racist work requires white people to really pull back the layers of how they perceive blackness itself. Because until that work is done, black people have to maneuver living in white supremacist projections of who we are, which is not fair to us, and that doesn't give us space to live our lives expansively and healthily and with the joy that we deserve to live it with. My name is Ciara Jones. I'm a DEI consultant and educator, so follow me for more content like this.
The veil of double consciousness refers to the unique psychological experience of African Americans, who must navigate the dual identities of being both black and American. Du Bois posited that this duality creates a constant tension and internal conflict, as African Americans are forced to reconcile their own self-perceptions with the perceptions and expectations imposed upon them by a predominantly white society. According to Du Bois, the veil of double consciousness arises from the historical legacy of slavery and the ongoing racial discrimination faced by African Americans. This dual identity forces Black individuals to constantly be aware of how they are perceived by others, often leading to feelings of alienation and a struggle to develop a cohesive sense of self.
97, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro, or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of 1 lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter, which I hadn't delivered, to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
You know, it's hard to be black in a world controlled by white folks. Du Bois said we always have the double consciousness. We trying to be black, and meanwhile you got a white ghost hovering over your head that says, if you don't do this, you'll get killed. If you don't do this, you won't get no money. If you don't do this, nobody will think you beautiful. If you don't do this, nobody will think you smart. That's the ghost. You're trying to be black, and the ghost is telling you to be a ghost. We hope you won't submit. In Newark, when we greet each other on the street, we say, what time is it? We always say it's nation time. We say, what's going to happen? We say, land is going to change hands.
W.B. Du Bois' concept of the veil of double consciousness is a powerful and insightful exploration of the unique psychological experiences of African Americans as they navigate the dual identities of being both Black and American. By examining the implications of this concept for identity formation and its enduring relevance in contemporary discussions of race and identity, we can gain a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by African Americans and other marginalized groups in developing a cohesive sense of self and asserting their place within a diverse society. Ultimately, the veil of double consciousness serves as a critical lens through which to examine the complex interplay of identity, perception, and societal expectations, and to promote greater empathy and understanding across racial and cultural divides.